The village of Eshe was a place of peace, where the earth met the sky in an unbroken line of golden plains, and the hills were shrouded in the deep green of ancient forests. In the mornings, the air smelled of warm bread baking over firewood, and the sound of women singing while they worked could be heard from every corner of the village. The men of Eshe were proud of their roles as protectors and providers. Every evening, they returned from the outskirts of the village with fresh game, their faces beaming with satisfaction. Their wives would greet them with love and affection, their hands always ready to embrace them. I was one of those women. My name is Amina, and my husband, Juma, was a good man. At least that's what I had always believed. He was the kind of husband who took care of his family, always kind and attentive. He never forgot an important day, always brought gifts from the hunts, and had a smile that could light up even the darkest of times. He was the pride of Eshe, as most of the men were, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't quite right. The more I thought about it, the more I began to notice subtle things. It wasn't just Yuma, it was all of them. In the evenings after their hunts, when the men gathered together at the fire, the laughter seemed too practiced. The way they spoke, their movements, their smiles, they all seemed so perfect, too perfect. A kind of rhythm they followed, a language that didn't feel real. At times, I wondered if the air itself in Eshe was thick with an unseen weight, something suffocating that I couldn't put my finger on. But the village had always been like this, hadn't it? The men returned from their travels, stories in hand, ready to share, and the women would listen, proud of their loyalty, their devotion. But then, one evening, as I sat by the river, I caught a glance of Juma from afar. He was talking to the other men, all of them gathered near the old baobab tree, their voices low. He laughed, but there was something hollow in it, as though his laugh was a mask, a barrier against something deeper. My heart twisted, but I shook my head. Perhaps it was nothing. Later that night, when Juma kissed me goodnight and whispered his usual words of love, I felt a shiver run through me. His eyes, always so warm, had become distant, unreadable. I tried to tell myself that I was overthinking, that I was simply tired. Yet, I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right, not just with Juma, but with the men of Asia. A week passed, and my suspicion grew. I began following Juma, watching him when he left the house early in the mornings, or when he returned later in the evenings. His steps were deliberate, almost mechanical. Every day I saw the same rituals, the same gestures. Nothing ever seemed to change. It was as though the life we shared was set on repeat, as if the hands of time were moving forward but leaving nothing new in its wake. The village, too, seemed stuck in this endless cycle. Nothing ever altered, except for my growing unease. One evening, when the moon hung heavy in the sky, I decided to follow Juma. He told me he was going to the grove as he always did, but this time I would follow him. As he walked, the shadows of the trees grew longer, and the air grew colder, thick with the scent of damp earth. My footsteps were soft as I moved behind him, careful not to be hurt. I didn't know why I was so determined to follow him. Perhaps it was the weight of all the questions pressing on me. Or maybe it was the inexplicable fear that something terrible was unfolding. He led me deeper into the forest, beyond where the village's paths ended. I felt my pulse quicken with every step I took. My feet seemed lighter, almost as if the earth itself was urging me forward. The forest was ancient, the trees twisted and gnarled as if they had lived for centuries. their roots sinking deep into the bones of the land. Eventually, we reached a clearing, a place where the forest gave way to a deep, dark pit in the earth, half hidden by moss and vines. I held my breath as I watched Juma kneel beside the pit. He whispered something, a chant that seemed foreign to me. He was no longer the man I knew. There was an unfamiliar darkness in his voice, a chill that slithered into my bones. My heart beat so loudly in my chest that I feared it would give me away. I could feel the cold of the night creeping into my skin, and yet I could not turn back. Not now. Juma climbed down into the pit, and without thinking, I followed him. The descent was steep, and the stone was slippery beneath my feet. When I reached the bottom, I felt an overwhelming sense of dread. The walls of the cavern were jagged and black, carved with symbols that seemed to pulse with an eerie light. The air was thick with the scent of burning herbs, incense, and something else, a metallic tang that made my stomach turn. Then I saw them. The men of Eshe were gathered in a circle, standing silently around the large stone altar, their eyes closed, their hands clasped tightly around wooden chalices. Their faces were calm, but there was something unnatural about their stillness. They were chanting in unison, their voices low and guttural. As I watched, I realized they were not just standing together. They were bound together in something far darker than I had imagined. Juma raised his cup, as did the others. They drank deeply, and then a strange silence fell over them. They were no longer the men I had known. Their eyes became vacant, their movements sluggish, as though their bodies had been drained of all purpose. It was then that I saw the women, shackled, their faces pale, their bodies bruised. They were prisoners, stolen from their villages, held in chains beneath the earth. I stumbled back, my heart hammering in my chest. Amina, one of the women who had followed me, caught my arm. She, too, had witnessed the horror. Her eyes were wide with shock, but I could see the fire in them, the resolve to expose the truth. We had seen enough. We needed to leave. But as we turned to make our way back, the sound of footsteps echoed through the cavern. We froze, panic rising in our chests. But it wasn't the men. It was a figure cloaked in shadows, a tall, imposing man whose face was hidden behind a carved wooden mask. His presence felt ancient, like the earth itself had given birth to him. He raised his hands and the chanting ceased. His voice, deep and resonant, filled the cavern. The brotherhood is bound. We are the keepers of the old ways, he said, his voice echoing off the stone walls. The blood of the oath runs through our veins. I clutched Amina's arm, and together we retreated into the shadows. We had to leave. We had to warn the others. We returned to the village, but I could not shake the image of the women in chains, the men of Asia bound by the curse of the brotherhood. When we arrived, Juma greeted me with a smile, his face innocent, unaware of the darkness that had overtaken him. I wanted to scream, to tell him the truth, but I knew it was pointless. He didn't remember. That night, I could not sleep. The weight of what we had discovered hung heavy in my mind, and when dawn broke, I knew that things would never be the same again. The truth was out there, hidden beneath the earth, and it was time for us to expose it. We gathered the women, our voices rising with fury, and I fear. We demanded answers, confronting the elders in the village square. The elders were quiet, their faces etched with the wisdom of ages, but there was no sorrow in their eyes, only resignation. We knew, one elder admitted, his voice rough with age. We knew, and it is not our place to change it. The truth hit me like a blow. The men of Eshe were not simply unfaithful, they were part of something far worse, something ancient and insidious. The potion they drank wiped their memories, made them slaves to the oath of the brotherhood. The elders had been complicit in it all, turning a blind eye to the horror because it suited them, and now we had a choice to make. The women of Eshe gathered, our resolve hardening like the stone beneath our feet. We would expose the truth no matter the cost. We would fight to break the chains that had bound us for so long. The flames of truth would burn away the lies. The temple would fall, and the men would have to face the consequences of their actions. As the first torch was lit, I knew there would be no turning back. The men of Eshe had to face what they had done, and we, the women of Eshe, had to face our own truths. No longer would we live in the shadows of their lies.